People are going to say to me, you know, you could have gone for 2 or 3 hours, and you know, or they will say you interrupted too much, or they'll say a lot of other things. And I do want to hear from you. And you know, many people saw Lyndon Johnson, you know, as a man who was too beholden to economic interest in terms of how he achieved his own wealth, and in terms of a whole range of things, whether it was brown root in Texas, or whether his relationship with a whole lot of institutions. But you were saying that he responded the way he did to great society programs having to do with medical care, having to do with poverty, having to do with a whole range of issues.
He responded
and
to
civil rights
pressures.
Because the public pressure was there.
The same was true of John F. Kennedy.
I'm willing to argue with you that Lyndon Johnson responded in part because that was where his heart was, and his sense of legacy in terms of what had influenced him.
Yeah.
You know,
See,
and secondly, some of the things that John Kennedy responded to, he saw his opportunity in history, in a sense, to show that he could get these things enacted, because that was his principal skill.
See, we're not disagreeing. We're talking about different topics.
Okay. Let me move.
The topic that you're talking about, it's individual personalities. So the individual personality, Lyndon Johnson, what was going on in his mind. The topic that I'm talking about is how popular movements develop, create their own programs, press for them, finally often get somebody to initiate them. Those are different questions.
Okay, and I may agree with you, actually. I mean, I look with great interest in what's happening in Brazil.
Yeah. And here, it's happened here. That's why do we have freedom of speech? I mean, freedom of speech is not in the Constitution. It's not in the Bill of Rights. In fact, up until the it's not. Up until the 1960s. In fact, the legal battles about freedom of speech are mostly in the 20th century. And there was no real legal protection for substantial freedom of speech, actually, until the 60s. In the 1960s, the Supreme Court finally, first in the course of the Civil Rights Movement, and later in the decade, finally realized a level of legal protection of freedom of speech that, to my knowledge, doesn't exist in any other country. And a large part of it grew out of the activism of the Civil Rights Movement.
Just to understand you, because I want to go to some things that are often attached to you and bring great controversy to you. Other than freedom of speech, what else do you think is part of what America represents? Yes.
Represents.
Well, is.
Good about American life. Well, there's a lot of things I like that are, I think, great about American life. For one thing, we have, compared with other societies, there's very little in the way of a kind of a caste system. Yeah. So people interact independently of social position.
Is there meritocracy?
There is, certainly in terms of policy formation. That's overwhelming. But we're talking in terms of personal interaction. Does it matter whether this is what you will do or that's what you do? Yeah. Well, these interactions among people, informal interactions, are, in my view, much healthier in the United States than other societies that I know. Now, those are important facts about a culture. Freedom of speech is not just a matter of law. It's a matter of being internalized, realizing, understanding that's my right and I'm going to defend it. That's important. And the same is true of other rights. Actually, the United States has become a much more civilized society since the 1960s, just in our recent lifetime.
Because, do you think?
Well, because of popular activism. Let's take women's rights. Was that an issue 40 years ago? No. Environmental issues, did they exist 40 years ago? No. Let's take something like opposition to aggression and violence. Attitudes on that have changed enormously. I mean, when John F. Kennedy attacked South Vietnam, as he did in 1962, direct attack.
You mean his assassination of Jim, or what?
No. When the U.S. Air Force...
First sent their supporters?
See, I mean, there was so little opposition to this that no one even knows what happened. But if you look back at the record, the historical and documentary record, it's not controversial. Yeah. In 1962, Kennedy sent the U.S. Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam. They did it in South Vietnamese planes with Vietnamese markings, but it was U.S. pilots and U.S. equipment, thin cover. He authorized the use of napalm. He started the crop destruction programs to keep food from the indigenous rebels. Wait a minute, he started driving millions of... Look, this is a war. Was there any protest?
No.
Okay, now that's changed.
Well, there may have been somebody who wasn't significant.
Look, I can tell you because I was directly involved in
it. We've got to know you because of your opposition to Vietnam.
You couldn't get 4 people in a room to talk about it.
I'm not arguing about this.
But this is important about the country. It was 4 or 5 years before a significant popular movement developed opposing an aggressive war against another country. Let's fast forward to today.
Right.
In this year, there were huge popular protests before the war was officially launched. That's a tremendous change in consciousness.
And why do you think that change took place? Because of the 60s? Because of because as it breathes, it gets wider and stronger, and
the change took place because a lot of people worked very hard to make it change place. The same is true of civil rights, of women's rights, of environmental issues, and so on. That's the way changes happen.
And when
the same thing happened in Brazil. The popular movements developed that way, not by some leader saying,
I agree with you. I do agree with you on that. I'm not arguing that. But the interesting thing about Brazil now, which is worthy of a program here, and he is somebody that I've heard him speak and would like to see him at the table, is he is disappointing some of his followers there because of some positions he's taking having to do with the rainforest and other issues.
You know why?
Why?
Because there are...
How come you know so much about everything?
Well, check it and see if it's right.
No,
I'm not trying to persuade you or anyone else.
No.
Here's what I think,
Right.
and I think if you investigate this, what you'll find.
All right.
Over the last 20 or 30 years, in part as a reaction to the democratizing tendencies of the 60s, which were worldwide.
Right.
They were dramatic here, but also elsewhere. There's been a backlash. Part of the backlash, it's taken many forms. One of the forms it's taken is international economic arrangements, which are virtually designed to undermine democracy. Well, what's called in the rest of the world neoliberal arrangements. Here it's called free trade, but it's not free trade. The array of international arrangements that's sort of formalized in the World Trade Organization. Those measures, if you look at them, it is well understood that they undermine democracy. One of the first measures that was taken in the early 70s, initially here, but then everywhere, was to free up flow of financial capital.
Right. I need to move on because I got a few minutes. That's my point.
Well, just once, I won't try to explain anything, but let me just say that if you look at these arrangements, you'll find that they undermine democracy and they place countries in a stranglehold in which they cannot follow the policies of the overwhelming majority. And that's what's happening in Brazil, and that's why Lula's disappointing his constituency.
Okay, fine. I'll move on. I talked to someone else, knowing that you were coming in. They said, I was in Iraq recently, and I met no Iraqi who said the war was a mistake. Lots of them in the idea of overthrowing Saddam, even now. And many of them wish the United States would leave. Many of them are terribly disappointed, upset, opposed to the way things are going. But this person said, I didn't meet anyone. Tell me how you feel about the use of American power in overthrowing Saddam. Was it because it violated your own sense of international law? Was it because that we didn't have, it wasn't a UN initiation?
I'm not going to be able to answer the question because the assumptions are wrong.
Okay, go ahead.
The United States was not in favor of overthrowing Saddam Hussein. In fact, George Bush made that explicit.
At the
Azores summit, a couple of days before the invasion started, Bush and Blair were there, and they issued a declaration in which Bush said, even if Saddam Hussein and his family leave the country, we're going to invade anyway. And in fact, that's consistent with a long-standing U.S. policy. You're right that I'm sure every sane person in Iraq wanted to get rid of Saddam Hussein, just like I have for 20 years, just like we all have. He's a murderous tyrant. Why is he there? Why wasn't he overthrown? Or to ask another question, why do the majority of Iraqis, when Iraqis are we have the published polls, Iraqis are asked, who's your favorite foreign leader? The favorite foreign leader of Iraqis, according to U.S.-run polls, is President Chirac of France, who was the symbol of opposition to the invasion.